Hello and welcome back to your comp sci tutor. Today we're going to have a look at my top 5 tips for answering trace table questions. So watch the video, try them out and see how you get on. Okay, number 1, so the first tip is to execute the code one line at a time. You don't want to jump ahead and especially if you've got a loop, execute lines of code that are inside the loop before they actually happen. Okay, just focus on one line at a time. It will make things much simpler for you and it means actually you're more likely to get the question right. Okay, tip number 2, this is actually related to the first one. If you cover up the code, then you can't see all of the code at once. You can only see the line of code that you're executing. One class that I had did this, they tried it and it really worked for them. So if you cover up any code that you don't need, you can just focus on the line of code that you're executing and then you can kind of move it down. So you can cover it up with a piece of paper, with a ruler, whatever you've got to help you not get distracted by all the extra code or not be too scared by it, because sometimes lots of code can make it look a little bit harder than it actually is. Okay, and tip number 3, this is for loops. So if you've got any iteration, if you've got a for loop or a while loop, um, every time you repeat the loop, every time you start a new loop, you start a new line in the trace table, so a new row. This will help you keep track of everything that's happening during that iteration. It's nice and easy with a for loop because you've got the loop counter variable, but with a while loop, this really helps you kind of lay out your trace table so that it matches what's happening in the code and it keeps track of what is happening during each iteration. Okay, tip number 4. So don't be scared of if statements. If statements look big on paper in terms of how many lines of code they are, but quite often you only have to execute 1 or 2 lines of code in the if statement because it's in separate blocks. So if there's an else if or just an else block, you might not have to execute most of those, depending on how big the if statement is. So again, if you are executing the code one line at a time, you just check the condition at the top of the if statement. If it's true, run through the line of code in that section. If it isn't, you can skip down to the else if or perhaps even an else. So if statements are easier than they look. Okay, and number 5, final one for today. Never go back up in the trace table. Okay, any new information that you're adding into your trace table should either be in line with other information or it should be on rows below in the trace table. So if you can imagine the trace table, we have the top part of the trace table is the first part of the code, and as time passes through our program, we should be traveling down through the trace table. So never go back up. Okay, so those were my top 5 tips for answering trace table questions. Give it a go, have a look, and see how you get on. Some of them might be useful for you, some of them you might be doing already. Let me know in the comments if there is anything else that you think other people might benefit from as well.